39. Criticism of modernism. Our institutions are no longer worth anything. That is a matter on which we are unanimous. But the fault is not in the institutions, but in us. After we have lost all instincts, out of which institutions grow, the institutions themselves are being lost, because we are no longer suitable for them. Democracy has always been the decadence type of organizing power. I have already, in Human All Too Human, characterized modern democracy, together with its incomplete forms such as the German Empire, as a declining type of the state. In order that there may be institutions, there must be a species of will, instinct, or imperative, anti-liberal even to malignity, a will for tradition, for authority, for responsibility throughout centuries, a will for the solidarity of chains of generations forward and backward in infinitum. When this will exists, something establishes itself, like the Imperium Romanum, or like Russia, the only power at present which has durability in its constitution, which can wait and can yet promise something. Russia, the antithesis of the pitiable European petty state misery and nervousness, which has entered a critical phase with the establishment of the German Empire. The entire Western world no longer possesses those instincts out of which institutions grow, out of which the future grows. Perhaps nothing goes so much against the grain of its modern spirit. We live for the present. We live very fast. We live very irresponsibly. This is precisely what we call freedom. That which makes institutions, in reality, is despised, hated, and repudiated. Wherever the word authority even becomes audible, people believe themselves in danger of a new slavery. Decadence goes so far in the appreciative instinct of our politicians and political parties that they prefer instinctively what disintegrates, what hastens the end. Witness modern marriage. All rationality has evidently been lost in modern marriage. That does not, however, provide an objection against marriage, but against modernism. Rationality of marriage. It lay in the sole legal responsibility of the husband. Marriage thus possessed gravity, while at present it limps on both legs. Rationality of marriage. It lay in its indissolubleness on principle. It thus acquired an emphasis which, opposed to the accident of sentiment, passion, and momentary impulse, knew how to make itself heard. Rationality of marriage. It lay likewise in the responsibility of families for the selection of the spouses. By the increasing indulgence in favor of marriages for love, the basis of marriage, that which first of all makes it an institution, has almost been eliminated. An institution is never, and never will be, founded on an idiosyncrasy. Marriage, as we have said, cannot be founded on love. It is founded on sexual impulse, on the impulse to possess property, woman and child as property, on the impulse to rule, which constantly organizes for itself the smallest type of sovereignty, family, which needs children and heirs to maintain physiologically an acquired measure of power, influence, and riches, to prepare for long tasks, and for a solidarity of instinct from one century to another. Marriage as an institution already involves the affirmation of the greatest and most permanent form of organization. If society cannot, as a whole, pledge itself to the remotest generations, marriage has no meaning at all. Modern marriage has lost its meaning. Consequently, it is being done away with. The labor question. The fact that there is a labor question is owing to stupidity, or fundamentally instinct degeneration, which is the cause of all existing stupidity. Regarding certain things, one does not question. The first imperative of instinct. I do not understand at all what people want to do with the European working man, now that they have made a question of him. He finds himself far too advantageously situated not to go on questioning further, always less modestly. At last he has the majority on his side. There is no hope now that a modest and self-contented species of human being, a type like the Chinese, will constitute itself into a class here. This would have been the rational course. This would have been almost a necessity. But what have people done? Everything possible to annihilate even the germ of the prerequisite for such a course. Through the most unjustifiable thoughtlessness, people have fundamentally destroyed the instincts in virtue of which the working man becomes possible as a class, possible for himself. The working man has been made capable of military service. He has been given the right to form unions and the right to the vote. No wonder he already feels his existence as a state of exigency, morally expressed as injustice. But what do people want? Let it be asked once more. If they want to achieve an end, they must also be willing to use the means. If they want to have slaves, it is foolish to educate them to be masters. Freedom which I do not mean. In such times as the present, it is an additional peril to be left to one's instincts. These instincts mutually contradict, disturb, and destroy themselves. I have already defined modernism as physiological self-contradiction. A rational education would claim that one, at least, of those instinct systems should be paralyzed under an iron pressure to enable another system to attain power, to become strong and predominant. At present, one would have to make the individual possible in the first place by pruning him. To make him possible, that is to say, to make him an entirety. The very reverse happens. Independence, free development, and laissez-aller are claimed the most vehemently, precisely by those for whom no restraint would be too severe. This is true in politics, it is true in art. But that is a symptom of decadence. Our modern notion of freedom is an additional proof of degeneration of instinct. 42. Where belief is necessary. Nothing is rarer among moralists and saints than rectitude. Perhaps they say the contrary. Perhaps they even believe it. For when a belief is more useful, more efficacious, and more convincing than conscious hypocrisy, owing to instinct, hypocrisy forthwith becomes innocence. First proposition for understanding great saints. Among philosophers also, another species of saint, the whole business involves the necessity of only admitting certain truths, namely those on the basis of which their business has public sanction. In Kantian language, the truths of practical reason. They know what they must prove. They are practical in this. They recognize one another by being in mutual agreement with regard to truths. Thou shalt not lie. That is, Mr. Philosopher, be on your guard in case you 43. Speak the truth. Whispered into the ear of the conservatives. What people did not know before, what they now know, or might know, a retrogression, a return in any sense or to any extent, is quite impossible. We physiologists, at least, know that. But all priests and moralists have believed it possible. They wanted to bring mankind back, to screw mankind down to an earlier standard of virtue. Morality has always been a bed of Procrustes. Politicians have even imitated the preachers of virtue in this respect. At present also, there are parties who dream of the crabwise march of everything as the final goal. No one, however, is at liberty to be a crab. There is no help for it. We are obliged to go forward, that is to say, step by step onwards in decadence. This is my definition of modern progress. We can check this development, and by checking it, we can dam up and collect degeneration itself, making it more vehement and sudden. We cannot do any more. My notion of genius. Great men, like great periods, are explosive materials in which an immense force is accumulated. It is always prerequisite for such men, historically and physiologically, that for a long period there has been a collecting, a heaping up, an economizing, and a hoarding with respect to them. That for a long time no explosion has taken place. When the tension in the substance has become too great, the most accidental stimulus suffices to call into the world the genius, the deed, and grand destiny. Of what consequence, then, is the environment, the epoch, the spirit of the age, or public opinion? Let us take the case of Napoleon. The France of the Revolution, and still more pre-revolutionary France, would have produced a type antithetical to Napoleon. It did produce it. And because Napoleon was of a different type, the heir of a stronger, more enduring and older civilization than that which vanished into vapour and fragments in France, he became master. He alone was the master here. The great men are necessary. The time when they appear is contingent. That they almost always become masters of their age just depends on the fact that they are stronger, older, and possess longer accumulated forces. Between a genius and his age, there exists a relationship like that between the strong and the weak, between the old and the young. The age is, relatively, always much younger, more slender, more immature, more unassured, and more childish. That people at present think very differently concerning this matter in France, and in Germany also, but that is of no consequence, that the theory of the milieu, a true neurotics theory, has become sacrosanct there and almost scientific, finding belief even among physiologists, that has a bad odour, it gives one melancholy thoughts. In England also, the thing is understood in the very same manner, but nobody will fret about that. There are only two ways in which an Englishman can account for a genius or great man, either democratically, in the manner of Buckle, or religiously, in the manner of Carlyle. The peril involved in great men and great ages is excessive. Exhaustion of every kind and sterility follow in their footsteps. The great man is a full stop. The great period, the Renaissance, for example, is a full stop. The genius, in work, in deed, is necessarily a squanderer. His greatness is that he expends himself. The instinct of self-preservation is, as it were, out of gear in the genius. The over-powerful pressure of the outflow of his energies forbids all such care and foresight. People call this sacrifice. They praise the heroism of genius, his indifference to his own welfare, his devotion to an idea, to a great cause, or to his country. It is all misunderstanding, however. He outflows, he overflows, he uses himself up, he does not spare himself, fatefully, portentously, involuntarily, as a river involuntarily overflows its banks. But because people owe much to such explosives, they have, on the other hand, bestowed much upon them. For example, a sort of higher morality. For that is the way of human gratitude. It misunderstands its benefactors. The criminal and those related to him. The criminal type. That is the type of the strong man under unfavourable conditions. A strong man who has been made sick. He lacks the wilderness, a certain freer and more dangerous environment and mode of being, in which all that is offensive and defensive in his instincts exists by right. His virtues are banned by society. The most lively impulses instinctive to him become forthwith interwoven with depressing emotions, with suspicion, fear, and disgrace. But this is almost the recipe for producing physiological degeneration. He who, with prolonged suspense, foresight, and cunning, has to do secretly what he can do best, and what he would do most readily, becomes anemic. And because he gains nothing but danger, persecution, and calamity through his instincts, his sentiment towards them quite alters. He regards them as fatalistic. It is society, our domesticated, mediocre, emasculated society, in which a man with his natural forces unimpaired, coming from the mountains or from seafaring adventures, necessarily degenerates into a criminal. Or almost necessarily, for there are cases in which such a man proves himself stronger than society. The Corsican Napoleon is the most celebrated case. For the problem before us, the testimony of Dostoevsky is of importance. Dostoevsky, the only psychologist, let it be said, from whom I had anything to learn. He belongs to the happiest chance incidents of my life, still more even than the discovery of Stendhal. This profound man, who was 10 times right to depreciate the superficial Germans, has perceived that the Siberian convicts, in whose midst he lived for a long time, capital criminals for whom there was no return to society, were not quite what he himself expected. They were persons carved almost out of the best, the hardest, and the most valuable material to be found in the Russian dominions. Let us generalize the case of the criminal. Let us understand the disposition of persons who, from any cause whatsoever, lack public approbation, who know that they are not regarded as salutary and serviceable to society. That Chandala feeling of being counted inferior, outcast, unworthy, and defiling. All such natures have the colour of the subterranean in their thoughts and actions. Everything in them becomes paler than those on whose existence daylight rests. But almost all modes of existence which we treat with distinction today have formerly lived in this semi-sepulchral atmosphere. The scientific man of character, the artist, the genius, the free spirit, the actor, the merchant, the great discoverer. As long as the priest passed for the highest type, every meritorious variety of human being was devalued. The time is coming, I promise it, when the priest will be regarded as the lowest type, as our Chandala, as the most mendacious, the most disreputable variety of human being. I direct attention to the fact that even at present, under the mildest sway of custom that has ever existed on earth, at least in Europe, every mode of separateness, every protracted, all too protracted condition of subjugation, every unusual, untransparent mode of existence, approximates men to the type of which the criminal is the climax. All intellectual innovators have, for a time, the pale and portentous sign of the Chandala on their foreheads, not because they are felt to be such, but because they themselves are sensible of the frightful gulf which separates them from everything traditional and honourable. Almost every genius knows the Catilinarian existence as one of the phases of his development, a hateful, revengeful, insurrectionary feeling against everything which already is, which does not any longer become. Catiline, the pre-existent form of 46. Every Caesar. Here the prospect is open. It may be loftiness of soul when a philosopher is silent. It may be love when he contradicts himself. In a knowledgeable man, a courtesy which speaks falsely is possible. It has been said, not without subtlety, it is unworthy of great spirits to spread the agitation they feel. Only one has to add that it may likewise be greatness of soul to have no fear of the meanest things. A woman who loves sacrifices her honour. A man of knowledge who loves, perhaps, sacrifices his humanity. A god who loved became a 47. Jew. Beauty no accident. Even the beauty of a race or family, the pleasantness and kindness of their whole demeanour, is acquired by effort. Like genius, it is the final result of the accumulated labour of generations. There must have been great sacrifices made to good taste. For the sake of it, much must have been done, and much refrained from. The 17th century in France is worthy of admiration in both ways. Good taste must then have been a principle of selection for society, place, dress, and sexual gratification. Beauty must have been preferred to advantage, habit, opinion, indolence. Supreme rule, we must not let ourselves go, even when only in our own presence. Good things are costly beyond measure, and the rule always holds that he who possesses them is different from him who acquires them. All excellence is inheritance. What has not been inherited is imperfect, it is a beginning. At Athens, in the time of Cicero, who expresses his surprise with regard to it, men and youths were far superior to women in beauty. But what labour and effort in the service of beauty had the Athenian males required of themselves for centuries? We must not make a mistake here with regard to method. The mere disciplining of feelings and thoughts is almost valueless. It is here that German culture, which is entirely illusory, makes its great mistake. We have first to persuade the body. The strict maintenance of a significant and select demeanour, an obligation to live only with those who do not let themselves go, suffices perfectly for becoming significant and select. In 2 or 3 generations, everything has become internalized. It is decisive for the fortune of a people and of humanity that civilization begins at the right place, not in the soul, as was the fateful superstition of priests and semi-priests. The right place is body, demeanour, diet, physiology. The rest follows from there. It is on that account that the Greeks are the leading event in the history of civilization. They knew, they did what was necessary. Christianity, which despised the body, has up till now been the greatest misfortune for the human race. Progress, as I understand it. I also speak of return to nature, although it is not properly a going back, but a going up into high, free, and even frightful nature and naturalness, such as plays may play with great tasks. To express it in a simile, Napoleon was an instance of a return to nature, as I understand it, for example, in respect of tactics, and still more in strategy, as military men are aware. But Rousseau, where did he really want to return to? Rousseau, that first modern man, idealist and canaille in one person, needing moral dignity to endure his own aspect, sick with wanton conceit and wanton self-contempt. And even this abortion which deposited itself on the threshold of the modern age wanted return to nature. Where, let us ask again, did Rousseau want to return to? I hate Rousseau. Hate him in the revolution itself. It is the grand historical expression of this dualism of idealist and canaille. The bloody farce with which that revolution played itself out, its immorality, is of little account to me. What I hate is its Rousseau morality, the so-called truths of the revolution, with which it operates to the present day, and wins over to itself everything shallow and mediocre. The doctrine of equality. But there exists no deadlier poison, for it seems to be preached by justice itself, while it does away with justice. Equality to the equal, inequality to the unequal. That would be the true teaching of justice, and the natural consequence, likewise, never make the unequal equal. That such dreadful and bloody events happened around the doctrine of equality has given a sort of glory and luridness to this modern idea par excellence, so that the revolution as a spectacle has seduced even the noblest minds. That is, after all, no reason for esteeming it any higher. I see only one who regarded it as it must be regarded, with disgust. 49. Goethe. Goethe. No mere German event, but a European event, a grand attempt to surmount the 18th century by a return to nature, by an ascension to the naturalness of the Renaissance, a kind of self-surmounting on the part of that century. He possessed its strongest instincts, its sentimentality, its nature worship, its anti-historic, idealistic, unreal, and revolutionary tendencies. The last is only a form of the unreal. He called to his aid history, science, antiquity, and likewise Spinoza, but above all practical activity. He encircled himself with nothing but defined horizons. He did not sever himself from life, but placed himself in it. He was not despondent, and took as much as possible on himself, over himself, and into himself. What he aspired to was totality. He struggled against the severance of reason, sensuousness, emotion, and will, preached in the most forbidding scholasticism by Kant, the antipode of Goethe. He disciplined himself to entirety. He created himself. Goethe was a convinced realist, in the midst of an age disposed to the unreal. He was affirmative of everything relating to himself in this respect. He had no more important experience than that ens realissimum named Napoleon. Goethe conceived of a robust and high-cultured personality, skillful in all physical accomplishments, keeping himself in check, and maintaining his self-reverence, who dares to allow himself the whole realm and riches of naturalness, and is strong enough for that freedom. The man of toleration, not out of weakness, but out of strength, because he knows how to use advantageously what would cause the ruin of average constitutions. The man to whom there is nothing prohibited, unless it is weakness, whether it is designated vice or virtue. A mind thus emancipated stands with a cheerful and confident fatalism in the midst of the universe, in the belief that only the single thing may be rejected, that on the whole everything is saved and maintained. He no longer denies. But such a belief is the highest of all possible beliefs. I have christened it with the name of Dionysus. We might say that, in a certain sense, the 19th century has likewise aspired to all that Goethe himself aspired to: universality in understanding and approving, a quiet reserve towards everything, an audacious realism, and reverence for all matters of fact. How is it that the sum total is no Goethe, but a chaos, a nihilistic groaning, a grievous uncertainty as to which way to turn, an instinctive weariness which in practice impels men continually to hark back to the 18th century? For example, as emotional romanticism, as altruism, as hyper-sentimentality, as feminism in taste, and as socialism in politics. Is not the 19th century, especially in its closing decades, merely a strengthened and brutalized 18th century? That is, a decadence century? So that Goethe would have been merely an episode, a splendid, vain effort not only for Germany but for Europe as a whole? But we misunderstand great men when we look at them from the narrow perspective of public utility. That we do not know how to derive advantage from them, that itself perhaps belongs to greatness. Goethe is the last German for whom I have reverence. He would have felt three things which I feel. We also understand one another with regard to the cross. People often ask me why in the world I write in German. I was nowhere less read than in my own country. But who knows, after all, if I even want to be read at present? to create things on which time vainly tries its teeth. As regards form, as regards substance, to strive after a little immortality, I was never yet modest enough to require less of myself. Aphorism and the sentence, in which I, as the foremost among the Germans, am master, are the forms of eternity. My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book. I have given mankind the profoundest book it possesses, my Zarathustra. I shall shortly give it the most independent one. My indebtedness to the ancients. 1. A word in conclusion with regard to that world to which I have sought access, to which I have perhaps found a new entrance, the ancient world. My taste, which may be the contrary of a tolerant taste, is here, as in other cases, far from making an unconditional affirmation. On the whole, it does not readily say yes, it rather prefers no. It likes best of all to say nothing whatever. This applies to entire civilizations. It applies to books. It applies also to places and landscapes. After all, it is only a very small number of ancient books that count in my life. The most celebrated ones are not among them. My sense of style, of the epigram as style, awakened almost instantaneously on coming in contact with Sallust. I have not forgotten the astonishment of my venerated teacher Corsen when he had to give the highest number of marks to his worst Latin scholar. I had done it all at once. Compressed, rigid, with as much substance as possible in the background. A cool malice against fine words and fine sentiment also. In that I found my vein. In my writings up to my Zarathustra, a very strenuous ambition to attain the Roman style, the more enduring than bronze in style, will be recognized. It was the same with me on my first contact with Horace. Up to the present, I have not received from any poet the same artistic rapture as was given to me from the very first by an Horatian ode. In certain languages, that which is attained there cannot even be willed. That lingual mosaic where every word as sound, as position, and as notion diffuses its force right, left, and over the whole, that minimum in the range and number of signs, that maximum thus realized in their energy, all that is Roman, and, if you will believe me, it is noble par excellence. All other poetry becomes somewhat too popular in comparison with it, mere sentimental loquacity. I am not at all under obligation to the Greeks for any similarly strong impressions, and, to speak out candidly, they cannot be to us what the Romans are. We do not learn from the Greeks. Their manner is too foreign. It is also too unstable to operate imperatively or classically. Who would ever have learned to write from a Greek? Who would ever have learned it without the Romans? Plato need not be brought forward as an objection to me. With respect to Plato, I am a thorough skeptic, and I have always been unable to assent to the admiration of Plato the artist, which is traditional among scholars. After all, I have here the most refined judges of taste among the ancients themselves on my side. Plato, as it seems to me, jumbles together all the forms of style. He is thus a first decadent in style. He has something on his conscience similar to the cynics who discovered the Satura Menipia. To be operated upon by the Platonic dialogue, that shockingly self-complacent and childish kind of dialectics, a person must never have read good French literature, Fontenelle, for example. Plato is tiresome. In the end, my distrust of Plato goes deeper than the surface. I find him strayed so far from all fundamental instincts of the Hellenes, so morally infected, so pre-existently Christian. He already has the concept good as the highest concept, that I should prefer to use the hard expression superior swindle with reference to the whole phenomenon of Plato, or, if people like it better, idealism, rather than any other term. People have paid dearly for this Athenians going to school with the Egyptians, or with the Jews in Egypt. In the great fatality of Christianity, Plato is the ambiguity and fascination called the ideal, which made it possible for the nobler minds of antiquity to misunderstand themselves and enter on the bridge which led to the cross. And how much of Plato is still in the concept of church, in the organization, system, and practice of the church? My recreation, my predilection, my cure from all Platonism has always been Thucydides. Thucydides, and perhaps Machiavelli's Principe, are closest to me in the unconditioned will to impose nothing on themselves, and in their determination to see the rational in reality, not in reason and still less in morality. There is no better corrective than Thucydides of the pitiable tendency to beautify the Greeks in the direction of the ideal, a tendency which the youth, trained in humanities, carries away with him into life as the reward of his public school drilling. One has to turn his writings over, line by line, and read his mental reserve as distinctly as his words. There are few thinkers so rich in mental reserve. Sophist civilization, I mean to say realist civilization, attains its most perfect expression in Thucydides, that inestimable movement in the midst of the moral and ideal swindle of the Socratic schools, which just then was breaking out everywhere. Greek philosophy as the decadence of Greek instinct, Thucydides as the great summary, the last revelation of that strong, stern, hard matter-of-factness which was instinctive in the older Hellenes. Courage in the presence of reality distinguishes in the end such natures as Thucydides from Plato. Plato is a coward in the presence of reality. Consequently, he takes refuge in the ideal. Thucydides is master of himself. Consequently, he also maintains power over things. To scent out beautiful souls, golden mediocrities, and other perfections in the Greeks, perhaps to admire their repose in grandeur, the ideal disposition, lofty simplicity. From this lofty simplicity, ultimately a German foolishness, I was preserved by the psychologist implanted in my nature. I saw their strongest instinct, the will to power. I saw them quake in the presence of the intractable force of this impulse. I saw all their institutions evolve out of protective measures to secure themselves mutually from their innately explosive material. The enormous internal tension then discharged itself externally in dreadful and reckless hostility. The city communities tore themselves to pieces in conflict with one another, in order that the citizens of each might find peace within themselves. People needed to be strong. Danger was close at hand. It lurked everywhere. The magnificently supple physique, the daring realism and immoralism which belonged to the Hellene, were a necessity, not a temperament. These qualities only came in course of time. They were not there from the beginning. And the Greeks desired nothing other than to feel themselves dominant, to show themselves dominant with their festivals and arts. These things were expedients for self-glorification, under certain circumstances for inspiring terror. To judge the Greeks by their philosophers in the German manner, to avail oneself perhaps of the affected virtuousness of the Socratic schools for clues as to what is fundamentally Hellenic. For the philosophers are the decadents of Hellenism, the counter-movement against ancient noble taste, against the agonal instinct, against the polis, against the worth of the race, against the authority of tradition. Socratic virtues were preached because they had been lost by the Greeks. Excitable, timid, fickle, all of them comedians, they had a few reasons too many for allowing morality to be preached to them. Not that it did help anything, but great words and attitudes suit decadence so well. I was the first for the purpose of understanding the older, still copious and even overflowing Hellenic instinct to take seriously that wonderful phenomenon which bears the name of Dionysus. It is only explained by a surplus of energy. Whoever had devoted his attention to the Greeks, like that profoundest student of their civilization living at present, Jakob Burckhardt of Basel, was at once aware that something has been achieved by it. Burckhardt inserted a special chapter into his Culture of the Greeks on the phenomenon referred to. If one wants the opposite, one should look at the almost exhilarating poverty of instinct in German philologists when they come into proximity with the Dionysian. The celebrated Lobeck especially, who, with the honest assurance of a worm dried up between books, crept into this world of mysterious states, and by being frivolous and childish ad nauseam, persuaded himself that he was scientific. Lobeck, with a great display of learning, has given to understand that all these curiosities are of no consequence. In fact, the priests might have communicated some important information to those who took part in such orgies. For example, that wine excites lust, that under certain circumstances man lives on fruit, that plants blossom in spring and wither in autumn. As regards that strange wealth of rites, symbols, and myths of orgiastic origin with which the ancient world is literally overgrown, Lobeck finds in it an occasion to become a trifle more ingenious. The Greeks, he says, when they had nothing else to do, laughed, jumped, and raged about, or because people sometimes also have a desire for that, they sat down, wept, and lamented. Others came there later on, and sure enough looked for some reason for the strange behavior, and thus the countless festival legends and myths arose for the explanation of those practices. On the other hand, people believed that ludicrous performance which customarily took place on festival days necessarily belonged to festal celebration, and they retained it as an indispensable part of divine worship. That is contemptible gossip. No one will take Lobeck seriously for a moment. We are affected quite differently when we examine the concept of Grecian which Winckelmann and Goethe had formed for themselves, and when we find it incompatible with that element, orgiasm, out of which Dionysian art evolves. In fact, I do not doubt that Goethe would have thoroughly excluded anything of that kind from the possibilities of the Greek soul. Consequently, Goethe did not understand the Greeks. For only in Dionysian mysteries, in the psychology of the Dionysian condition, does the fundamental fact of Hellenic instinct, its will to life, express itself. What did the Hellene pledge himself for with these mysteries? Eternal life, eternal recurrence of life, the future promised and consecrated in the past, the triumphing affirmation of life beyond death and change, true life, as the universal continuation of life by generation, by the mysteries of sexuality. On that account, the sexual symbol was to the Greeks the symbol venerable in itself, the intrinsic profundity within all ancient piety. Every detail in the act of procreation, in pregnancy, and in birth awakened the most exalted and solemn sentiments. In the doctrine of mysteries, pain is pronounced holy. The pains of childbirth sanctify pain in general. All becoming and growing, all pledging for the future, involves suffering. In order that the eternal delight of creating may exist, that the will to life may assert itself eternally, there must also exist eternally the pains of childbirth. All this is implied by the word Dionysus. I know of no higher symbolism than this Greek symbolism of Dionysia. In them, the deepest instinct of life, the instinct for the future of life, for the eternity of life, is felt religiously. The way itself to life, procreation, is recognized as the sacred way. It is only Christianity, with its resentment against life at its foundation, which has caused sexuality to be regarded as something impure. It cast dirt on the beginning, on the prerequisite of our life. The psychology of the orgy, as an exuberant feeling of life and energy, in which pain even operates as a stimulus, gave me the key to the concept of tragic feeling, which has been misunderstood by Aristotle as well as especially by our pessimists. Tragedy is so far from proving anything with regard to a pessimism of the Hellenes, in the sense of Schopenhauer, that it is rather to be looked upon as the decisive repudiation of pessimism, and as a verdict against it. The affirmation of life, even in its most unfamiliar and most severe problems, the will to life, enjoying its own inexhaustibility in the sacrifice of its highest types, that is what I called Dionysian. That is what I recognized as the bridge to the psychology of the tragic poet. Not in order to get rid of terror and pity, not to purify from a dangerous passion by its vehement discharge, it was thus that Aristotle understood it, but beyond terror and pity, to realize in oneself the eternal delight of becoming, that delight which even involves in itself the joy of annihilating. And hereby I again touch at the place from which I once set out. The birth of tragedy was my first transvaluation of all values. With that, I place myself again on the soil out of which my willing, my ability has evolved. I, the last disciple of Dionysus the philosopher, I, the teacher of eternal recurrence. The hammer speaks. "Why so hard?" the charcoal once said to the diamond. "Are we not near relations?" "Why so soft, O my brothers? Thus I ask you, are you not my brothers? Why so soft, so unresisting and yielding? Why is there so much denial and abnegation in your hearts? Why is there so little fate in your looks? And if you are unwilling to be fates and inexorable, how could you conquer with me some day? And if your hardness would not glance and cut and chip to pieces, how could you create with me some day? For all creators are hard, and it must seem blessedness to you to press your hand upon millennia as upon wax. Blessedness to write upon the will of millennia as upon brass, harder than brass, nobler than brass. Only the noblest is perfectly hard. This new table, O my brothers, I put over you. Become hard.